Hello, I'm Vincent. I'm here to talk to you about a brand new open source framework called Taipy that my company released a few months back. Taipy has been designed for and developed for over a year and has been developed together with large companies, leaders in retail, in manufacturing, in fast food. Let's get started with the product. Okay, so let me resize and start the presentation. So it's all about building applications for business users. So this is very important. There is still a huge market in that field, and we don't believe Python has reached its peak here. Taipy is really about business application in Python. So what are the business needs? So what we noticed over the years is that there are a lot of pilots that are being developed by different groups of people using Python. A lot of these pilots stay pilots. They do not make it into a full application. So Gartner estimates that there is about 85% of failures, basically pilots that stay pilot, that don't make it towards a real application used by real business users. Okay, so what do we mean by, what kind of application am I talking about? So I will use the word decision support system here, which covers a very wide range of application, from the sophisticated system using AI, whether it's machine learning, deep learning, reinforcement learning, and so on. Could be simulation, could be operation research, which are basically one field of applied mathematics where you build, planning, scheduling, different types of models. It can be a very specific algorithm, or it could be simply data that you want to expose to the end user, but the end user is present here. So the software that we're talking about is software that will help the user make decisions. So basically, it's a very wide scope of apps. One of the issues that you face when you have end users using your application is that giving them an algorithm will not get you very far. So you need to do something more than just coming up with an algorithm, which is really where we felt there was a big void in Python to fill here. So what's Taipy's answer to that? So we came up with really two bricks that really come together very nicely. One is called Taipy Core, which is basically the pipeline orchestration for the execution, basically, of the Python backend, and the Taipy GUI, which is really for the front end, as its name indicates. So it's really Python packages that are low code, easy to use, can be used by data scientists, Python developers, and so on. So Taipy GUI is a very rich graphical interface. It's really to build complete interfaces, multi-pages, and so on and so forth, that can scale. It is very interactive. Then there is Taipy Core, which is about pipelines, execution. But when you deal with end users, you need scenario management. You need to do what-if analysis. You need to have some monitoring of the KPIs. And you need to have a very efficient execution of your programs, of your pipelines. Okay. So let's look a little bit at the landscape, Python landscape here. So first, on the graphical side. So as most of you guys, all of us have used Matplotlib and all these libraries here, which I call widget libraries. So they give you basically specific graphics, whether it's a line chart, a bar chart, and so on and so forth, that you want to use. But they do not link all these. They do not create a complete interface. So these are very commonly used. But again, you cannot build a full interface for the end user only based on that. These are very specific widgets, graphical widgets. There was an attempt by Streamlit actually to go above that. So it's a pretty good product which you can use. Unfortunately, it's very hard with Streamlit to scale, to build a real application. The way it manages the graphical events is pretty limited. So it's usually a good tool for pilot again, but hard to use for real application. The other issue also is that it doesn't work on notebook. It's really just for Python scripts. So that's where you are in terms of the easy to use, fairly low code to come up quickly with a graphical interface. Not everything for pilots, but not much for full applications. On the other side of the scale, of course, you've got Plotly, Plotly, tkinter, which are really complete graphical environments. You can certainly build very sophisticated graphical interface. Unfortunately, it requires a lot of coding, and that's not where we are. So there was this huge void here between these products here, these packages, on those here. And that's where Taipy fits, to have basically the power that you have with Plotly in particular, with, the capability to build quickly interfaces and to build real projects. So that's Taipy GUI here. On the Python backend, what we call Taipy Core, we were very frustrated with what we could see in the marketplace. So one of the tools that we looked into and we used was Airflow, which is a pipeline orchestration package. Unfortunately, its learning curve is not simple. I mean, it's fairly complex, and it requires also quite heavy coding. On top of this, it's great for task execution, but it's missing a lot of very important features for us that we built, in fact, in Taipy Core. So Taipy Core has this pipeline modeling layer, but it has extended that to deal with what-if analysis, scenario management. That's very important for end users to have this capability. We have also caching capability. Caching is key. Airflow doesn't have that at all. So caching allows you, when you have pipelines that you have run maybe one time or twice, or not to run again certain tasks, because if you run them again, you will produce files and data that's not going to change. So there's no need to rerun certain tasks within your pipeline. So that's what we call caching. Data scoping is also a very important functionality, so that you can share data between your pipeline, your scenarios, or not, to avoid replicating data files or data all over the place. So caching is really very good for saving time on your resources, computing resources. Data scoping is really to save space on the disk and to be very thrifty and save disk space by sharing files very precisely. And of course, the learning curve, which is also very easy with Taipy Core. So you can use Taipy Core almost right away. The learning curve is very short. So that's these two components, Taipy GUI and Taipy Core, that really come together to build a full application for end users. So let's start to have a look at Taipy GUI. So Taipy GUI, like Taipy Core, very easy to install. You just do a pip install Taipy, and you import the GUI. So it runs on Python scripts, and it runs also on notebook. So here, for instance, you can see a simple notebook on the side. And what I'll be doing just now is to show you a bit of coding, similar things, using some code that I have here. So let's look at this. So what you see here is a very simple, your first program using Taipy GUI. As you will see, Taipy GUI is an extension, an augmented version of Markdown. So we'll start initially with something very simple. We'll import Taipy, and we'll create a Markdown text here. So it's a string that you will pass to the Taipy GUI object. My page here, you pass the string, and we'll see, how it goes if I run this program here. Okay, so I'm going to execute this, and it's going to launch a server. It's running on the browser, and you will see the output here. So let me look at this on the code here. So you can see that the Markdown really displays correctly. It's pure Markdown. This is a title. This is in italic according to the Markdown. So something very simple, and you can see that the server is started on your browser, and you can see the output here. So let's look at something a bit more complex. So here I'm still looking at Markdown text. Then here I have my first Taipy GUI object. Taipy is basically, the Taipy GUI objects are really identified with these less than, greater than signs here. And inside I have a Python object here. So it tells me that this is a text for Taipy GUI because of this signs here. And inside this, I have a Python object called myParam that I want to display. The value of this is 10, so it's just an integer. So I'm going to print basically this parameter, which is a Python object, and I have another Markdown here just to print on the screen. And I have a second object, second Taipy GUI object, which is a slider. So it's a particular type of object with an initial value. It's connected to this param value here. And this slider has some property. It will be able to slide basically between the value 1 up to the value 50. Okay. So let's run this program here. Okay. So let's run this program too. Again, it's going to launch the server here, and you can see the result on that side. So I'll go full screen here, so you can see that it's doing what it's supposed to do. I have the title, I have the print of the parameter here, and I have my slider which I can play with, and you can see that relationship here between the printing of the value on the slider. Okay, so let's do a little bit to finish something a little bit more complex, which is this program here. Same thing, I have a parameter that I will print another Markdown sentence here, the slider, no change here. Then I'm going to display a chart now. So this chart is a line chart, okay, that is connected to data. So what is data? Data is actually coming from this function here. So let me show the full screen so that we can have a look at this more clearly. So basically, as you can see, data is computed here by calling the sign function here. The sign function will basically compute a list, so the y value of a function, which is a sign function, okay, with a parameter called decay. Okay, so I'm just coming up with a list. So this list will be plotted as a chart here. And what I would like to do is when I modify the parameter, I want the decay parameter to be modified here. So I create, some kind of a callback here, this callback function, where I detect which value will be changing. So here it's the param value that I'm considering, which is actually passed as the parameter here. If this is the variable that is getting modified by the slider, typically, we are going to re-plot or re-graphically update the graphical object associated with data, which is the chart here. Okay, so let's basically run this program again. Okay, which is program number 3 here. And we will see what goes on here. So I do get, the display of the sine function with the right parameter. So initially the parameter is set to 1. And as I play with this parameter, you will see that the decay basically reacts accordingly, thanks to my function here, my callback function here. Okay, so that's what the graphic is all about. Of course, if you go to our website, so let's go to the Taipy website, you've got the documentation online that you have in the resources here, and you can see on the Taipy GUI documentation in the user manual, for instance, so we can have a look at the various visual elements that are available for you. So you've got text, buttons, slider, that's the one we just saw, numbers, toggle, charts, various type of charts, and so on and so forth. So you have the documentation online for you to have a look at if you wish to. Okay, so let's go back to our presentation here. So that was that. Okay, so in terms of the next stage is Taipy Core. Okay, so we have looked at the graphics. Because I just showed you parts of the graphics. You will see you have demonstration on the full demos on the website that shows you, more complete usage of Taipy GUI. But let's move to Taipy Core. So for this, we will be using a very simple pipeline. Some of you may be very familiar with the concept of pipeline. Some of you might be new. It's not very complicated. It's basically a set of tasks that follow each other or interact with each other. So here the tasks are in orange colored. Okay, so we have only 2 tasks. And the input and output are basically these blue squares here. So the clean data task basically takes an input called initial dataset and generates an output called clean dataset, and so on and so forth. So it's basically a little program that loads the data, cleans the data, then it predicts basically a set of values. Okay. So let's have a look at what it does. So again, I will go through an example here. You can use, again, notebooks. I'm going to use right now the code using a PyCharm here. So the first thing we have here is basically the 2 tasks that we talked about before. So there were 2 tasks and a few data nodes. Okay, so let's look at these data nodes. So you remember there was the initial data set. So in this case, it's a CSV file. So you need to create basically this configuration, this pipeline that we talked about. For this, there are 2 elements we'll be considering, what we call data node, which are, the data that we have shown as the square, the blue square, and you have the tasks that were the orange colored elements in the graph. So we have basically a set of data nodes. So the first one is initial dataset, and we call this initial dataset CFG config. Okay, so that's the first data node. I've got another one. In this case, this is just a date. Okay, that's another data node. So I create all my data nodes, and I had a few of those that were created. And I start with creating the task after this. So, there's a first task, clean data, that we looked at. And we need to define what's the input and what's the output and what's the content of that. So typically a task is a Python function. Okay, so that's a Python function that we have defined here. I'm not going to go into it. It doesn't really matter what this function does. And I have another function called the predict baseline, which is some Python code here. So the task is really made of a function, a Python function, and a set of input data nodes and output data nodes that I've defined above. So this function basically takes as input the initial data set and takes as output the clean data set. Baseline is basically the same thing. You have a function which is a Python thing. It has two input data nodes and one output data node. Okay, that's it. Once I've done that, I can create the whole pipeline. So I can create a pipeline. So these are Taipy functions. You give it a name and you basically list the tasks that belong to this pipeline. And Taipy will figure out the order because you have already explained, the input, the output. So it can create all the precedence charts automatically, the precedence between the different tasks. So you have created your pipeline, and now it's a matter of uncreated it. It's a matter of running it, executing it. So it's a very simple pipeline again. We're going to submit it and basically see the output of this pipeline. And this pipeline is basically going to call, for instance, some of the functions like the prediction, the cleaning and the prediction task, and so we can see the output of this. So let me run this particular program, and of course there's no graphic at this stage. We are looking at the Python backend, and we can have a look at the result. So here we have the two tasks of the pipeline that have executed themselves. So first the cleaning, second the prediction. You can see the jobs that correspond to the execution of these tasks and the predictions that have been generated here. So again, it's very simple. I didn't create any complex pipeline with parallel tasks and so on and so forth. So this has been executed, and that's okay. It's generated what I wanted. So let's suppose I want to re-execute again this particular program. So let's do that. Okay. You can see that the first task is actually skipped. This is the caching effect here. As you may not have noticed, in the diagram, in the code here, we actually described the data here as cacheable. I mean, the data set, the clean data set is cached. So basically, if the input on nothing has really changed, there's no need to regenerate this clean data set because it will generate the same thing again. So immediately, Taipy notices there is no need to run it again. That's why you have this step that is not executed. It's skipped. Only the second step is executed. Okay. So just quickly, and to finish on the Taipy Core, there's a lot more to it than what I'm showing you, but that's some of the basic steps. One thing you can do after you have created your pipeline, so this is the same code as before, you've got the pipeline coming up here, and you can see that we create scenarios. Scenarios are variation, if you want, of pipelines. So here, what I would like to do is to predict with a different parameter each time. So for this purpose, you can create in Taipy a scenario. You need to specify, what pipeline you are using. So here I'm using the pipeline that I created earlier. Okay, but each time, when I create the scenario, I will be able to modify some of the parameters of the pipeline. So for a given pipeline, I will have different versions of that pipeline corresponding to different day from which I want to predict. Okay, so this is what I'm doing here. I've created this function, create scenario. So how does it work? What I'm going to do is create, a start date and end date, and I will do a loop for these 2 days, for the 26th and 27th, and I'm going to launch 2 scenarios, okay, which is basically launching the pipeline for different values, which correspond to 2 different scenarios. The first scenario is going basically to, we're going to create the scenario and execute the scenario corresponding to a particular date, okay. So in this case, I'm going to use the start date, which is being increased. So I will start running this first pipeline with a value of the day set to 26, and the second run will be for 27. So it's like having 2 scenarios. Okay, so I'm going to run this, and you will be able to see the result of this. So you can see actually that 2 scenarios have been run. The first scenario is for the 26th. The second scenario has been run for the 27th. And for each of these scenarios, you get the predictions that have been generated for these days. Okay. Okay. So basically, I'm going to stop in terms of the first exposure to Taipy GUI and Taipy Core. What you have also are demos that you can find on the website, which really combines, the Taipy GUI, Taipy Core, where you create scenarios. So it's a much more complete demo. You have access to the code on GitHub, so that can give you a better understanding of this. Okay. I really recommend you to go to the website for this, where you'll find tutorial, online documentation, getting started to get you understand this and so on. One last thing, I want to highlight, the roadmap, which is extremely exciting for the next few months. First, Taipy GUI will open up and will be able to connect with most of the external libraries, such as Matplotlib, Seaborn, and if you need a particular chart, a particular graphics, you will be able to import it through, because we'll be providing an API for this in this release. So this is release 2 for Taipy, version 2. Later in November, we will announce Taipy Cloud, which is a hosting for our open source users. We will support also big data in this particular release, and later a very important component, which is Taipy Studio, which instead of going through the steps for creating the pipelines, with coding, you will do that graphically from your favorite IDE, for instance, in Visual Code. Okay, so all of this will be announced in time, and it will be, again, extremely interesting to see that. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please do so, and looking forward to seeing you in PyCon Korea. Bye-bye.